Welcome back, everybody. This is part 2 of the Chapter 11 screencast. We have been talking about government and the economy. Part 1 of the Chapter 11 screencast, we were talking about government intervention in the economy by looking at how does the government protect individuals in the economy and how do they make markets work better through regulatory agencies. This part 2 of chapter 11 is going to look at how should the government address externalities and public goods. So overall in this unit, we've been looking at market structures and market failures. Chapter 7 looked at the different market structures. Remember, we talked about perfect competition, oligopolies, monopolies, monopolistic competition, and then the end of chapter 7 talked about market failures. So remember, a market failure is when goods and services are not allocated efficiently. And oftentimes, when we're looking at a market failing, we're looking at things like externalities and public goods. So that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about. This should be a review of the crash course video that you looked at a couple of days ago. And again, the end of chapter 7 talked about positive and negative externalities and public goods. But today we're going to specifically look at what's the government role in dealing with those things. So when externalities are essentially spillover effects resulting from production or consumption. So they are costs or benefits that are affecting somebody other than the producer or the consumer of a good or a service. And externalities, remember, can be negative or positive. A couple of examples of negative externalities are air pollution and secondhand smoke would be negative externalities associated with driving and smoking. Without government intervention, those negative externalities could cause really great harm on the public, on everybody. So governments can also be equally helpful in promoting something that has a positive externality. So an example of that would be immunizations. So immunizations prevent individuals from getting harmful diseases, but they're also preventing individuals from spreading that disease to other people. That would be a positive externality. So to encourage immunization, the government requires children to have vaccinations against common diseases before they can enroll in a public school. So again, there's a cost and a benefit beyond that of just the producer and the consumer. It's everybody. So there's a couple of different things that we can look at. The government is going to attempt to limit negative externalities because they tend to have more costs associated with them, and they're going to promote activities that have positive externalities. Again, both of these things, remember, are market failures. We're still not allocating goods and services efficiently necessarily, but positive externalities are going to have more benefits. Maybe the benefits are said to outweigh the cost, whereas negative externalities, the cost is outweighing the benefit. So government's going to try to limit those negative externalities, and they do that through command and control policies or different market-based policies, which I'll touch on in a second. And they are going to support or promote activities that have positive externalities, and they do that through subsidies or public provisions. So, for example, let's start with the positive. The supporting positive externalities. Goods and services that generate a positive externality tend to be underproduced relative to their benefits. And higher education is a prime example. Your book goes on to great detail about this on page 208. So you could take a look at some graphics that they have and read about it a little bit more if you want. But essentially they're saying that people that go to college or higher education are going to gain the benefit of higher incomes. However, education is also a benefit to society by creating a more productive workforce. It's a positive externality. To support the positive externality, federal and state government allocate resources to education, and they do this through subsidies and public provision, which means providing the education itself. So, for example, a subsidy is something that is like in the form of a grant. Okay, so the government subsidizes both the consumers and the producers of education. They give subsidies to college students in the form of grant. Grant money does not have to be repaid. They also give out student loans. So by allowing that, it's giving the consumer the ability to attend those higher education universities. They do this, it's a cost to the government by providing that money to students or borrowing it to them, but the benefit is said to outweigh that cost by having a more educated, more productive workforce. An example of a public provision, if the positive externality is large enough, the government might choose to finance the production of a good or service itself. So in education, federal and state governments provide most of the revenue needed to support public colleges and universities. So that would be an example of a public provision. Another example of a public provision is the U.S. Postal Service and federal air traffic control systems. So they help support and provide the revenue needed to support those industries because the benefit to society is so great. So one of the problems with negative externalities is something called the tragedy of the commons. Oh, wait a second, we forgot to go back. Sorry, everyone, bear with me. Let's go back here for a second. Forgot to talk about limiting negative externalities. Sorry, small little hiccup there. Okay, really quick. So how the government can work to limit those negative externalities. A command and control policy is a regulatory agency saying, hey, you cannot do this. So they're going to basically issue a rule that everybody is supposed to follow. Like the Environmental Protection Agency uses command and control policies to help reduce air pollution. So it's like making a rule or a law about something. A market-based policy, and this is the one that economists really prefer. This is using an incentive rather than a rule to change producers' behavior. So they might do something like a corrective tax. This is when the government gives producers an incentive to reduce harmful waste or pollution by using this tax as a penalty. So the tax could also have the benefit of raising revenue for the government, but they would say, okay, if you are going to continue to create this harmful pollution or this harmful waste, we are going to tax you this much. So it's giving that tax money to the government, but it's also giving an incentive to the producer to pollute less. Okay, sorry, now moving on. Tragedy of the commons. So one example of a negative externality comes up when property rights are not clearly defined. So the air is a common resource. Water, land can be seen as a common resource, which means everybody has access to it. And because of this, it could be overused or even destroyed. And this is what we call the tragedy of the commons. So when common resources are destroyed through overuse, we refer to that as the tragedy of the commons. So kind of like the example is showing you, when we've just got one farmer on this land, he's using it privately, he's preserving by limiting the number of cattle that are grazing on that land. In a common field where you've got a bunch of different farmers taking advantage of this free grass for their cows to graze on, the farmers are putting as much cattle as possible on this land, and then we have overgrazing that turns this healthy field into eventually a field that can't be used anymore. So when property rights aren't clearly defined, a lot of times people lack an incentive to care for that common resource and to ensure that that resource is preserved for future use. We see problems like this with overfishing. If everybody goes out and takes all of the fish and they take more than one fish at the same time, there's not eventually going to be enough for everybody. So we deplete those common resources when we don't have restrictions or different things put in place to limit the public use. So there's different ways that we can preserve these common resources. One way that you might be familiar with is a tollway. We don't have tolls in Minnesota, but if you've gone on road trips and you travel from state to state, you might see highway tolls. They're going to provide revenue that can be used to maintain that role and provide the function of a corrective tax. So it might offer an incentive to limit the use of certain roads or for or for people to carpool or to take public transportation. So it's going to help preserve that common resource. Putting out a quota, saying that you can only use so much of a resource during a certain period of time would be another way that you could preserve a common resource, or you could turn to privatization, which would be turning a common property into a private one. So this brings us to the conversation about public goods. So what's the government's role in providing public goods? Government plays another widely accepted economic role as a provider of public goods. Remember, public goods are things that are non-excludable and non-rival. They can't be denied to anyone. They can be consumed by more than one person at a time. We're talking about things like public parks, public libraries, park benches, street lamps. So these are essentially market failures because they are not allocating the goods and resources necessarily efficiently. And they're also going to be something that a private seeking firm is not going to provide a good that consumers don't have to pay for. So the government is not trying to make a profit, but they're paying for those public goods with tax dollars to make sure that everybody's contributing in some way. But most people want the government to provide those public goods. National defense is another example of a public good. But remember, we have to look at scarcity forces the trade-off principle. So this idea that of kind of a free rider problem, we are all enjoying the benefit of public goods and services, roads, public schools, national defense, street lamps, park benches, but we're not paying for it. So ultimately that free riding is a problem, and it's a market failure that's leading to that underproduction of a good or service. We have to make decisions. No government has the resources to provide everything that people might want. So remember, there's going to be choices. There's going to be trade-offs. The government can't do everything. The government's going to have to decide what they spend their money on. So before the Great Depression in the 1930s, the federal government basically followed a hands-off policy towards the economy. So following the events of the stock market crash of 1929 and the fact that we were in the worst economic crisis in history, the government took a more active role. The federal government took a much more active role in the economy. It created new programs, new agencies, some of these regulatory agencies came out of this. And ultimately, the goal was to promote economic stability. And Americans are clearly going to benefit from economic stability. There's more secure jobs, goods and services are available, prices are predictable, producers, consumers, investors can plan for the future without having to worry about this big change in the nation's economy. And there's a couple different ways that the government can do this. The government's going to promote economic stability in part by creating a currency that we all use that maintains value. The government also promotes stability by stimulating business activity during economic slowdowns. So whether it's a tax incentive, investing in new equipment, offering tax rebates, encouraging consumers essentially to go out and spend more money, there is an incentive in the government providing some of that money and those breaks to people to help keep the economy moving. Income distribution and poverty in the United States is also something that comes up when it comes to government intervention. So there is a section in your book that talks about the government's role in redistributing income. So for a lot of our nation's history, there wasn't always a government provided way to help redistribute income. Now we have programs that do that, whether it's Social Security, assistance to students by providing grants, which we mentioned before, scholarships, student loans. These are things that are going to promote well-being, subsidizing food, allowing training or workforce training, moving out of welfare into the workforce. Again, they're considered market failures because there's a cost to them. They're not necessarily allocating the goods and services efficiently, but there is a great benefit, positive externality. The downside is critics are worrying that these anti-poverty programs promote dependence on the government and reduce people's incentive to become self-sufficient. There are a lot of different means-tested programs that your book talks about that are all tied to family income. The bottom line is that the government plays a limited but important role in the economy. The goal is to protect property rights, regulate the marketplace, correct market failures, and promote the well-being of the American people. There's much more information in Chapter 11, so if I rush through this last part and you feel like you missed something, please, I encourage you to go back and revisit the reading of Chapter 11 in your textbook. Don't forget about Screencast Part 1. If you're joining us just for Part 2, make sure that you've watched both screencasts for Chapter 11 and you have reviewed the text for Chapter 11 before this unit assessment. Thanks for listening.